I think many of you are aware that Roxanne and I have just become grandparents of recent, and in thinking about children, it's natural, especially if you are already a parent, to think back on how it was when your children were very young and how they grew and developed before your very eyes. And children are just so amazing to see their personality develop, to see them grow into themselves, to see what they have talents and abilities to do. But even beyond those items, the things that we teach them and how we direct them and so forth, you actually learn, I think, as a parent more yourself than sometimes the kids learn. I'd like to begin today in Scripture in Matthew 18. Because Christ used children, especially in this example, he used them as a teaching point, if you will. And I'll come back to some of the setting here in just a moment, but I just want to read this verse. So Matthew 18 and verse 3, Christ, in answering a question or addressing a perspective or an attitude that had come up with the disciples, he said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven." And this is a very interesting statement to make and to consider why he made it. How do we become little children, like little children? We could look at some of the negative aspects of children. Do we throw tantrums when we don't get our way? There are people, unfortunately, that do that. Do we act on our impulses without thinking things through? Do we go through life letting others take care of us? I miss those days, right? I didn't have to drive anywhere. I didn't have to grocery shop. I didn't have to, do a lot of house maintenance. I didn't have to do things. It was all provided. But that's not where we're supposed to stay, is it? How do we fulfill this admonition here from Christ and become like little children? Well, I think it's safe to say that Christ is talking about the positive aspects of children as they develop and how we respond. And so generally speaking, children have some really wonderful characteristics. They don't lust for power or control. So even in their worst, they'll somewhat demand of things, but they don't have the same lust, if you will, for these things. That comes later, unfortunately, with human nature. They don't care about titles, right? They don't even know sometimes what those titles mean, to address somebody as Mr. or Mrs. or this is a president or this is somebody with this title or that title. They don't care. Even when they get angry, they tend to not hold on to it, right? They can lash out even at times, but oftentimes it dissipates and goes away very quickly. They're eager to learn. They're very quick to learn. I think I've mentioned a number of times, I always find this very interesting in terms of development. A child, it has been said, will learn more in the first 5 years of their life than they will the rest of their life. Because you think about it, they're learning to speak, they're learning to eat, they're learning to dress themselves, they're learning just so many things, how to walk, and all of these things. So they're very eager to learn. They're easily entreated, as a rule. They even love when they're corrected. If the rest of their environment is supported with that love, even when they're corrected, they know that they're still loved and they love back. And so they cling to family, right? That separation even is something they have to learn how to deal with. I remember, I don't remember the person's name, but I remember the event of someone when I was in kindergarten having a meltdown when their parent had to drop them off at school because they had never been separated before and they didn't know what to do with that. And children are very concerned pretty much with just the necessities, right? They don't care that their clothes match. I think that happens when you get old too. They don't care necessarily about everything else. They don't even know sometimes of all the other things. It's just as long as they have a warm house, a full belly, and a place to sleep, they're pretty good to go. And then lastly, they believe what they're told, aren't they? And you have to be very careful around children for that matter, because they trust. They don't understand oblique things, and they don't understand when people are lying and guys. But of course, we're obviously not physical children anymore, most of us here. Although sometimes I think I have lapses. But these are attributes worth considering, aren't they, in terms of who we are to be, who we become. And so that's what I want to look at today. I want to look at what it means to become like little children. So we're here in Matthew 18. Let me just read verse 3 again. Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And so again, Christ is talking about more than just the outlook or the expectations of children. So I'll come back to this section here in a moment. So if you want to put a marker there, let's go to Mark chapter 9, and I want to read the companion or the parallel account to this that Mark recorded, because it's slightly different, which adds some other meaning, if you will, to what Christ is referring to here. So Mark 9 will begin in verse 33. So it says, as he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, the home that he was visiting at that time, he turned and asked the disciples, what was it that you disputed amongst yourselves on the way here, on the road? Verse 34, but they kept silent. This is setting some of the context here. They were silent, it says, because on the road they had disputed amongst themselves who would be the greatest. Right? Simply by him asking the question, it probably came to mind that this was probably not the right thing to be disputing about. And so then he, in verse 35, he sits down, he calls the disciples and says to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. And then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one of these little ones in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Now, to give the disciples a little bit of deference here, if you will, to cut them some slack, they were convinced that Jesus Christ was coming as Messiah to restore all things that time. And being physical, they were focused on the physical kingdom. They were focused on the restoration of Israel. They were focused on the Romans no longer ruling over them. They were focused on some of their history that they were familiar with and having that restored. And so then by extension, they wanted to know what place they would have in that. That by itself is not wrong. But what they did was take it to a level of who's going to be in charge. So it sets them apart, doesn't it? It divides them, as opposed to them being a family, a group. And unfortunately, this is a natural human desire. We heard about some of that in the sermonette, right? We're used to titles. We're used to position. We're used to authority. We're used to having the corner office. We're used to some of these things that show that we're important. We see this in a corporate environment especially, but we see it in sports teams, the competitions that we have. We see it in anything. You play a musical instrument. Who's first chair? Everybody wants to be first chair. They want to be good enough to be recognized as that. We want to know where we stand in relationships around us. We want to know if we're the top or not. If others are subservient, if you will, to us. But let's go back to Matthew 18. I want to read more of the context there. In Matthew 18, in verse 1, we find the disciples then having this same discussion. And it says here that they asked, they came to Jesus, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now again, they were asking on a physical level. That becomes obvious. They wanted to know who would have the rank. Peter's the most important, then who else, down the list of 12. But in doing so, they weren't reflecting these childlike attributes that we've mentioned to this point, were they? And so Christ then begins pointing them to the correct outlook. And it's not just a general outlook. It morphs into matters of how God governs, but also how we relate to other people. And so then we come to some of these other verses. He was trying to correct them on the outlook that they had, to move them from a strictly human carnal perspective. So to consider it, were they eager to learn at this point? Were they easily entreated? Were they concerned with just the necessities? Were they willing to love others as themselves? This is what Christ was leading them to. And so as we continue here, again, verse 2, he calls the child to them, and he says what we've read a couple of times now in verse 3. And so then in verse 4, he says, therefore, whoever humbles himself as a little child is the greatest. That's the answer to the question they asked. They asked, who is the greatest? And he said, whoever's humble like a child. And it's like, okay, let me think about that for a little bit, right? Because maybe they're thinking about some of those negative attributes, not necessarily focused on the positive aspects of children, and they have to begin to shift gears because that's counterintuitive to the way we naturally, humanly think. And so then he says again, verse 5, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. And then verse 6 is very interesting because he takes it a step further, and he says, whoever causes one of these little ones, we'll come back to that expression in a moment. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depths of the sea. That's a pretty powerful statement. It's better that he's dead than to offend one of these little ones. Now, let's go back to that expression. The expression there in English, little ones, in the Greek, can mean someone of age that is little, but it more specifically means the least or the less. So think about it in terms of what Christ is trying to have the disciples understand here. So he's talking about someone who has the perspective that I am the least or the less, right? That's not that you have no self-confidence. It's not that you have self-doubt or that you think you're of no value. That's not what he's referring to, because I'll go point you back to verse 4 where he talks about this humility, right? Who am I sort of perspective. Well, we're a child of God. That's what he's developing us into, which is everything, isn't it? It's not that it's nothing, but it's how we become that little child. And so we're to develop those positive attributes, the matters of being eager to learn, being easily entreated, to love when corrected, all these positive things. But I think Christ here is also talking about protecting the little ones amongst us, right? Someone new to the faith, or even someone who grows up in church. They're seeing all kinds of things. The one thing about children is they don't miss a whole lot. Right? So you can say one thing, and this is universal for humanity, but children especially. If you say one thing and do another and tell them to do the thing that you didn't do, they're going to look at that as hypocrisy, right? That hypocrisy turns them off. So it's also, what Christ is referring to here is also talking about protecting the little ones amongst us. And that can run the spectrum, can't it? What makes me a little one? Is it just the number of years I've been baptized, number of years I've been in the church, number of years I've been married, learning those things? It is other responsibilities that I try to take on to serve. In that respect, we're all little ones, aren't we? Little ones compared to Jesus Christ. But let's move to chapter 20. It's over the page or so, depending. Matthew 20, and we'll begin in verse 20 here. We come back to this matter of greatness. The disciples struggled initially with this concept. Now, to sort of skip ahead beyond the scope of this sermon, I think they learned what he was talking about, because if you look at the history of where those apostles went and how they served and how every one of them except John, and it wasn't lack for the trying of the emperor to kill him, but every one of them died an early death, right? So they caught it. They did get it. But in this case, they're still learning. And so in this case, it's Mrs. Zebedee comes to them, right? The mother of James and John. And she comes with him, to him, Jesus Christ, comes to Jesus with her sons, kneeling down and asking something for him. She came in a very deferential way, which is to her credit. But notice what she's asking. She said, I want to ask something of you. And he says, okay, what is it? Verse 21 to continue, she said, grant that these two sons of mine may sit, one on your right and one on the other one on the left in your kingdom. Now, to her credit as a mother, she didn't say, this one's on your left and this one's on your right. She still wanted both of them there, but she was letting Christ make that decision, which I find a little humorous. But it's a bit bold, isn't it? Okay, but she's going to ask. I give her credit for asking. But here's his answer in verse 22. You don't know what you're asking. You don't really understand the scope of what you're asking. Because he said, probably speaking to James and John here, are you able to drink of the cup that I'm about to drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they had no real understanding or perspective of what that meant, did it? They still didn't grasp, even up to the night that he was crucified, that this was how he was going to die, even though he repeatedly told them. And so without thinking, they said, yep, sure, yeah, we're able. And so he said, okay, yeah, you will go through that then. Verse 23, you will indeed drink with my cup and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit on my right hand or on my left hand is not mine to give, but is for those to whom it is prepared by my Father. You're asking the wrong guy. But you will learn. Now, then we see the human nature, don't we? In verse 24, the other 10, this is one of those understatements in Scripture. It says they were greatly displeased. They were probably livid with the other two. And I suspect part of what they were so angry about was that they didn't think to ask before they asked, thinking they missed out on something. But notice what he brings it back to in verse 25. Jesus then called to himself and said, you know the rulers of the Gentile lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority. This is the typical view in the world, right? If I have power, if I have a title, if I have control, I'm over people. He says that's not the way it should be, verse 26. Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great. That was the question back earlier, wasn't it? Matthew 18. It's essentially the question that Mrs. Zebedee is asking of Christ. Who's the greatest of my sons? So he says, but whoever wants to be great, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Which again is we heard in the sermonette. Christ came to serve. He came to set up a way of life completely opposite to the way the world thinks, the way the world currently operates. Those who want to be great in the kingdom have to have the perspective of serving, because that's what Christ did. I mean, every day he was serving, wasn't he? He was serving because every day he had to make sure that he didn't sin. Every day he had to make sure he was close enough to the Father to have that strength to draw on so that he would not sin. And everything was leading up to that moment of Passover in 31 AD when he would give his life for everybody. That's service on a level I don't know that we can comprehend. And yet that's what we're supposed to emulate. Christ is talking about authority. He doesn't say authority is wrong. What he's saying is how the world uses it is wrong. So with that in mind, let's consider 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 3. There's a longer discourse in this chapter where Paul is showing Timothy, giving him insight as to what attributes various ones should have if they're going to be set apart as an elder or a deacon. And I'm not going to go through the whole section, but I just want to pull out a couple of things. 1 Timothy 3 and in verse 4, one who, in terms of an overseer, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. Now, this is not someone who's autocratic. This is not someone who's dictatorial, right? Because notice what it says at the end. The children submit with reverence, not with fear, with reverence. Verse 5, if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Right? God is going to entrust us with other children he's going to bring along. And so will we model that example to them, the attributes of what it means to be childlike? To sort of say, yes, I have this authority, I have this responsibility, but I was there. I can walk you through the things that I did and how God was merciful and gracious and the repentance that he granted me and all these different things. To have that humility while we set the example. Because if we can't serve our families, how are we going to serve God's people? All right, so let's go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians 10 and then verse 12 will begin. Paul repeatedly took it on the chin, if you will, because there were not a few that questioned his authority as an apostle, questioned his authority as a minister of Christ, basically wanted their own following, which goes back to the problem that the disciples initially had, right? There were ones that wanted the authority, the power, the control that they thought Paul was using. And so he has to address this on a number of cases. This is one such, but notice how he does it. Notice what else he says. He says, "For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves." They can, get into this argument of who's better because of this reason or that reason. He says, well, I'm not going to go there. Because he says, but they measuring themselves by themselves and compare themselves amongst themselves are not wise. Why? Because their standards are their standards, not God's. Right? Well, I should be in charge because of, fill in the blank. I'm smarter, I'm more handsome, I'm more talented, I've been here longer, any number of things, missing the point of what it is they're to do. So verse 13, we, however, will not boast beyond measure. So just think about that for a moment. He didn't say we won't boast. We won't boast beyond what is proper. What would he boast in? He boasted regularly in the churches. He boasted when they followed the instruction that God inspired him to give. He boasted that they were part of God's family. Those are the things that he boasted in. But he says, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us. The sphere of influence. Right? I'm not responsible for all congregations of the United Church of God. I'm very grateful for that. Right? But I am responsible to serve the brethren in these three congregations. I am responsible to do things God asks me to do as an elder. So this is what Paul's talking about. He says, in this sphere, which especially includes you. So verse 14, for we are not overextending ourselves as though our authority did not extend to you. For it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ. We came to serve you. How does this fit in with what I'm talking about here? Well, we're picking up with what Christ ultimately got to, and that is, how do we govern? How do we serve? Those are the broad contexts on which we hang what we become. But we will not do those things properly if we don't have that childlike attitude. Because again, that eagerness to learn. I can only imagine what it's going to be like to be eternally spirit. But one of the things I'm really looking forward to is all the things that we will learn. There's so many things we don't understand now, right? Even the weather. You can look at this. One of the things that I think about on a regular basis, and there's no answer to it until I understand a deeper level of just how God creates things. But how does all that moisture stay up in the sky? I know it's gaseous state, right? But it still has weight. And when enough of it gets together, there's enough weight that it comes down, either snow or rain or hail or these other things. But then it cycles. Just all of the processes. We look out, this new telescope, the Webb telescope that's up there now, in addition to Hubble. And they just keep finding more and more and more and more. And they're finding things that are completely beginning to rewrite what they thought they understood how these things worked. There's one, I just read one this morning. There's a sun that's spinning through a certain part of the universe. It's not part of a galaxy. It's like rogue. It's just been bounced or something. Somehow it's on its own, but it has one planet stuck in its orbit. So this thing is just flying through the universe. And they're like, well, how does that work? And they don't know. So they have to figure out all the physics of how all that works. So there's just so many things we're not going to know, but do we have the eagerness to learn even more of God's way of life? It tells us the end of Isaiah in 66, we're going to be keeping the Sabbath through eternity. What does that mean? We're no longer limited to 24-hour time periods, are we? What is it that God views in terms of what that Sabbath really is, what it points to? Or do we love even when we're corrected? These various things that I'm talking about. Do we cling to family? So let me just read with you Colossians 3. This is very similar to what Mr. Merriman talked about in Philippians 2:5. I actually initially had that in my notes and I took it out. So I'm glad he mentioned it. But Colossians 3 and in verse 12. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies. Think of these in attributes of what a child should reflect, especially a child of God. Tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering. Right? The expression, I just find it very interesting. I had someone recently tell me that's a new father. He said, I thought I had patience until I had a child. And it's not that the child is awful. It's just, they get colicky. How do you settle it down? They get hungry all the time. They just, all the care that you have to take care of for a newborn. He says, I'm learning a lot about myself. So, verse 13, bearing with one another, right? Because sometimes, believe it or not, we get on each other's nerves. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes it does happen. Forgiving one another. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have within the body of Christ. We hold on to hurts, unfortunately. But bearing with one another, forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you. And that's a huge statement right there. So you're not willing to forgive so-and-so and you still expect Christ to forgive you? Okay. Verse 14, but above all these things put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts. Let that rule in your hearts. If you want, you can write down Genesis 4. Go back and read what God told Cain he should rule over. Right? He told him to rule over sin. Well, how do you rule over sin? You rule over it in part by having the peace of God rule your heart instead. Right? It's not just a matter of getting rid of things. The old saying about, nature abhors a vacuum. It's going to fill it with something. So if we have to get rid of this human nature and all the characteristics that come from that, magnified by Satan, what do we replace it with? Well, this is one such thing, the peace of God. To have that love as a child, to have that willingness to learn, to have that care and clinging to family, to believe what you're told. It frustrates me. I probably should stop watching them, but every so often I come across these videos, and there's one fellow in particular, I won't name his name, but he's got an answer for everything in Scripture and why it's not what it says. And so one such that I watched yesterday was they said that the Bible does not condemn homosexuality. And it's like, just a basic understanding of Greek, you can't make that statement. But to trust God, how do we know he's going to do what he says he's going to do? Well, he promises us that he will, right? And he says he will not lie. He cannot. And if that's the case, then do we act accordingly? Do we act on that? So he said, let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. That's another aspect of little children. You can give them the most innocuous thing. right? It could be something out of your pocket. Here's a gift for you. They will think the world of that, right? Because you gave them something. Do we even consider that with Christ? All the things that he gives us. So in Ephesians 5, I'll just mention this one, and you can look it up later, put it in your notes. Ephesians 5 and verse 21 is another statement reminding us to submit to one another. And in my estimation, this is a big part of what the disciples were initially missing, especially in what we read there in Matthew 18. They were missing the fact that they were to submit to one another as well as Christ. We're not in competition with each other. Right? My role as a pastor takes nothing away from anyone else. This is just what God has asked me to do. And quite honestly, I can't do everything. And there are members, and I'm very appreciative of it, that do a lot of things that I'm not doing. That's the benefit of being in a family, isn't it? I don't have to do everything. You don't have to do everything. I don't have to have every talent, every ability. I would go crazy trying to do that. But you can have a talent, you can have a desire, you can have a focus on something that I'm not the same, which means that that's getting taken care of in a way that I could never do that. That you can learn that in this family setting, in terms of being a child. But let's go to 1 Peter 3. I mentioned Mr. Merriman read Philippians there, but let's go to 1 Peter 3 because it's very similar to that. 1 Peter 3 and in verse 8. Peter writes here, he says, finally, as he begins to conclude this letter, he says, finally, all of you be of one mind. To be of one mind. That doesn't mean we don't have different opinions. It means that in purpose, in focus, in desire, and in the fact of us being together, we're in agreement. That's a challenge. Because again, we may not forbear with one another. We may not forgive one another when we need to. But we have these reminders. Be of one mind. Whose mind? Mr. Merriman showed us Philippians 2:5, the mind of Christ. Have that mind in us. Not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you are called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. Be of one mind so that we can have a blessing. To me, it's not so much, and I don't want to minimize this, it's not so much the knowledge or the understanding that God gives us. It's what we do with it. Are we trying to internalize it? Right? Because God can give us what we don't have, but he can't give us what we won't start. We have to begin the process. But if it's not there at all, he can't do anything with that. Right? Which is why we need to be engaged. Children, you can't do anything with a child who refuses, can you? Sometimes you have to just wait that out until they're at a point where you can teach them. But just people in general. It is impossible to teach somebody that doesn't want to be taught. Somebody that has a thought or an opinion they're not going to budge on, you can't do anything with that. So are we of one mind? Are we like that child that clings to family, that even loves when corrected? And so let's go back to Romans 13. We have all of this as a perspective of how we should function internally, if you will, within the body. But we also need to remember we need to be the example to the world around us, because at some point, God's going to begin to call them, either in the near future or as he fulfills the last 2 holy days of his holy day plan. And are the people that know us now, that let's just say they die and they come up in the second resurrection, are they going to say, are you kidding me, when they see us? Or are they going to say, okay, there are a lot of things that make sense now. So Romans 13 and verse 1, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. It is really easy to be angry at the world. be angry at politicians, be angry at the waste, the greed, the corruption. It is really angry to the point that we can be very disparaging. And that's not a good place to be, because God allows this, doesn't he? He allows it for now. And some places appoints those people for various reasons. Because we read that here, continuing in verse 1, for there is no authority except from God. So when we disparage authority, we're indirectly disparaging God. To go back to those childlike attitudes, do we say, okay, and not let it affect us, right? We can see that it's wrong. We can see that it's not going to play out the way they think it's going to. We can see all these things, especially because of God's Spirit. But again, what do we do with it? He says, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So we're back to this matter of governance and how this becoming like a child reflects even beyond us and what we're going to have or be a part of in the future to what currently exists. Are we childlike in that regard? So, a few more verses. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 14 next. First Corinthians 14 and in verse 20. Paul here writes, he says, brethren, do not be children in understanding. See, we are to grow in those things. We are to learn like that child that learns how to tie their shoes and to button up their coat and to work zippers and to dress themselves and put the shoes on the right feet, and to feed ourselves and to learn to write and just all these things that we go through, right? We grow in these things. So he says, okay, don't stay in children in knowledge. Build on those things. Learn, grow. But he says, however, in malice, be babies. Be like a baby, right? In the sense that they don't harbor these long-term things. They don't hold on to this. You can strongly, even in tone and voice, you can strongly correct a child, and they may cry, they may, not be sure of what's going on, but you pick them up and you love them and you say, I will always love you. I just don't want you to do that behavior. It's not right. And if they know they're loved, it goes away, the fear, the concern. So he said, in malice, in anger, but in understanding, be mature. And so then 1 Timothy 5, let's go there next. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 1, Paul again directs here, he says, do not rebuke an older man. He's speaking to Timothy as a young pastor, probably in his early 20s. How do you show respect to an older man and yet still fulfill the responsibility he has as a pastor? He says, well, don't rebuke him. Rather, exhort him like a father. Right? That approach is much softer, much gentler. It's more personal. Younger men, approach them as brothers. Older women, approach them as mothers. Younger women, approach them as sisters with all purity. How we approach one another to show respect. To not come with malice up front. To not come with anger, animosity, not coming to correct in a wrong way or to control or to show, I'll show you who's in charge, sort of thing. But to give respect. I'll just tell you as an elder, when I've had to do these things, for me, it's very uncomfortable. If I have to correct someone who's much older, I have to do it differently, right? In order to not offend them and yet to show what needs to change. And when I've done it this way, it's just amazing how everything softens and everything works. Because it's what God desires. It's what he's put into place. All right, let's conclude with a couple of verses in Revelation chapter 3. And it might seem like an odd place to take this, but hopefully the way I connect this connects with you as well. Revelation 3 and verse 7, John here is writing under inspiration these what we call letters to the churches. Chapter 2, chapter 3, and in chapter 3 here, we're in the section where he's writing to the church of Philadelphia. And so Revelation 3 and verse 7, To the angel of the church of Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. Verse 8, he says, I know your works. See, I've set before you an open door, no one can shut it. Notice that you have a little strength. You know, I still remember some of the times, especially in unfamiliar settings, when I would, as a child, I would hold my father's hand. And I knew everything was okay. Dad would take care of stuff. You know, even if it went sideways, he would be there. That comfort of knowing that little strength. This is the same word that I mentioned earlier. This is the word mikros, this less than. We have less than, don't we? One of the lessons I'm convinced we need to learn as a church, as a whole, is that there really isn't much that we have to do except let God do it through us. Right? I mean, humanly, we want to fix problems. We want to try to, make things work. We want to push through. And on some level, those things are fine. But when it comes to what God is doing, just to be that little child, trusting God knows what he's doing, trusting that we're in the right place, that he's going to take care of these things. And if so, then he says, no one's going to stop you. That's what verse 8 is talking about. He's going to open a door. No one's going to shut that. He's going to close one. Nobody's going to open it. All we have to do is follow, obey, but follow. And so then let's move down to verse 12, Revelation 3 and verse 12. He who overcomes. See, we are to be changing, growing. As I said, I'm convinced the disciples learned the lesson from Matthew 18 because they exemplified it in their lives and in their deaths. And this is part of our calling, is it to overcome. We're not called to stay as we are, to come as we are. We're called to change, to overcome. He says, if you do that, I will make you a pillar. Right? Pillars are structural supports. Right? They allow for open space, but if I take a pillar out, if I took this pillar out over here, I'm going to compromise that section of the roof. I'm going to have problems with the structure of the building. We're going to be part of what God uses to give structure to his kingdom. And he says, when that happens, he said, you'll go out no more. We will always be in his presence. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from heaven, and I will write on him my new name. Right? I'm no longer going to be Dan Dowd. I'm going to be the Son of God and whatever these names are. Growing up in that family, all of us. You and I have been given knowledge of God's plan of salvation. That's a unique understanding. No other church in the world, no other religion, I should say, understands that. What is the point of life? What is God doing? What is the future? What happens after death? All these questions, we know these things. Or are we in the right frame of mind to move forward in Christ, to be part of God's family? Are we teachable like little children? So let's take the admonition Christ gave to his disciples and become like little children before him.